Welcome to the Worldbuilding Workshop, the companion podcast to the book of the same name. My name is Stephen Slota, and here with me is my co-author, my co-host, the Wario to my Mario.
Trent Hergenrader.
He is. He's. I thought about saying the Baron Harkonnen to my Paul Atreides, but thought that was a little unfair.
Okay, yeah.
Well, today we are going where men, women, and people of all genders have dreamed of visiting an actual, factual, real-life world-building workshop. Yes, you heard that right. After 20 episodes of Trent and I talking the talk, the two of us are going to walk the walk by walking you, the audience, through the construction of a brand new story world. So this is something we've not done before, but we're planning it as a 3-episode arc. And today, for part 1, we're going to review the 4 structures and 14 substructures of the world building card deck while we deal out numerical values, and the two of us will discuss, debate, possibly defenestrate as we figure out the basic scaffold for the fictional cinematic universe we're going to create together. In part 2, we'll color in the details by generating places, things, institutions, and other parts of this world we're working on. And then finally, in part number 3, we'll implement Trent's handy-dandy character building system to drop some sentient beings into our freshly crafted world. So before we start throwing down on this world-building endeavor, Trent, why don't you give us a bit of history about where this idea came from and how it went from concept to card deck?
Yeah, thank you, Steve, for that excellent introduction. If you've listened to previous episodes or haven't, or read the book, this moment in my graduate school when I was designing this world building class around a post-apocalyptic Milwaukee, one of the things, so the idea was we're going to read some post-apocalyptic literature, play some Fallout, talk about the different qualities of post-apocalyptic stories. And then the second phase was we're going to do this world building. And I didn't really know even what it was going to be like. And then the third part was going to be doing tabletop role playing where students would experience the world that they created. And the class worked really, really well. But one of the things that I noticed while we were playing the campaigns is that during the world building, we didn't do anything about trying to figure out how this post-apocalyptic Milwaukee worked, like what their values were, whatever. Because someone said something about, they made a comment and it's like, oh, that would be sexist. And then someone's like, well, does sexism even exist in this world? And then that got me sort of thinking, right? Like, okay, wait a minute. What else haven't we thought about? So then this is over the years, right? I've taught lots of different world building classes. I started realizing, okay, if I go back, like I should try to develop a system that any world, whether it's historical or fictional or whatever, should have some sort of model that we could say, okay, we're going to sort of figure out how these different aspects, these essential parts of a society are, how they work in relation to each other. And one of the things that I discovered as well, once I started working on, I looked through some sociology stuff, looked through some other areas that, other areas of study that look at societies, and then came up with, I think it was around 16 or 15 or something like that. And I started up just with those. And what I found, I did one conference workshop at GLS, the Games Learning Society conference. And the thing that I found, and I did this a couple times with academics, is that they always wanted to build utopias. No one wanted to build a world that had really ugly parts to it. So I thought, okay, so this is where you need to take that out of people's hands, because we know, we talk about Handmaid's Tale because it's a great example of a terrible world that no one would want to live in, but it makes for great fiction. And this is where we know Margaret Atwood, the author of that, is not a fan of theocratic states that, are crushingly oppressive, especially to women. But that's the world that story is set in order to make a point about that world, right? Like everyone is pushing, or the protagonists are pushing against that world. So I started thinking, okay, well, a card deck would be good. And I didn't because I thought too, you're going to need to have values that are both high and low, or, excessive or very small or whatever. And if you roll a 6-sided die or a 10-sided die, you could get the same value 4, 5, 6 times in a row. And I didn't want that.
Right.
So I started boiling it down, and through a lot of trial and error, through a lot of play testing, we wound up with these 14 categories and then numbers from 1 to 5. And there's a couple things that are sort of important to keep in mind. That so this is through play testing, that having this as a card deck where each of the 14 categories, there are 3 in the structure of governance, there are 3 in economics, there are 4 in social relations or social equality, and 4 in cultural influences. So that's a total of 14. And what I've noticed noticed, and having done this over many, many years, that seems to be the sweet spot. If you throw in a 15th or a 16th right off the bat, it gets a little bit harder to sort of figure out what it is that you're doing with the world. There's just too many kind of questions that come up. And if you do fewer than that, then there's not enough variety. So that seems to be the best thing. 14 categories that are from 1 to 5. And this is a really important part of this. The numbers don't mean good or bad. They mean either a 1 would be something that is a low or a weak value, or something that is not present very often, or people don't think about it, or it could be actively oppressed. Whereas a 5 is something where it is ubiquitous in this world. You couldn't step foot in this society without noticing it, because it is just prevalent absolutely everywhere. And then 2s and 3s, right, and 4s are those areas in between. And then out of all of these 14 categories, there are 4 that are trending. And that means that there's some sort of social upheaval happening. It could be, the values are increasing, meaning they're becoming more prevalent, or they're falling, meaning they're becoming less prevalent. But it's important to just sort of put aside whether we think these are good or bad. Like, I think most people would agree that having more equality for people would be good, but we just want to kind of say, okay, is there more equality or less equality, just to make it clear that because wealth distribution, these other things, like, we may have our ideas about what is good or what is bad, but it doesn't really matter. It's sort of like what the world, the idea of this is what a reasonable person would look at the world and say, yeah, these values pretty much explain it. Like, I may not like this one, I may not like this one, because there's things we don't like about our world. So then the question becomes, if you were of that opinion, how in this world would you try and push for greater wealth distribution or greater racial equality or something like that? So it's built in order to give you some sticky problems. The best thing usually when we start off, when we deal out a whole bunch of these worlds, is you look at the 5 values and you look at the 1 values. What are the things that are really, really strong in the society, and what are the things that are really, really weak? And then you start thinking about how are those work in connection, and then usually taking a look at the trending values and deciding, in this particular case, do we think that these forces, these strong and weak forces, would be causing some of these values to trend up or trend down? And then the other big question is, at what rate are they trending? So, you have an event like Pompeii, and the world changes overnight, right? There's a volcano that explodes, blacks out the sky, people are killed, whatever. The entire world changes within, hours. Whereas we have something like fighting for, women's suffrage, we've talked about in the book, we've talked about in this podcast, or, gay marriage, things like that. These things are contested over decades, right? And they may take a long time. So that's sort of another element that there's not really a mechanic for, but we can just sort of talk through. And the last thing that, we should probably, we can go through the categories and explain them before we start turning over the cards. But the other thing that to remember with all of this, and it's quite intentional, is that these are supposed to be pretty open to interpretation. So like the first category in governance is government presence, which means like how involved is the government in daily life. And a 5 meaning it is overwhelmingly in daily life. That could mean either a negative, like it's a totalitarian regime in which everybody is being recorded all the time, and you're going to have a black car pull up and knock on your door if you do anything wrong.
Too close to home, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Or it could just be like a commune in which everybody knows everything about everybody else in order to support them. There are no secrets between neighbors or things like that. So it could be sort of like a utopian commune, or it could be sort of a totalitarian state. So again, getting away from that idea of a 1 or 1s and 5s being good or bad, and just thinking about their sort of presence in the world, their availability, or their importance in the world is important to remember. And then what you'll find is, we're going to run through this once. And normally it'll take in my classes, often it'll take a week or two to get through describing what all of these values mean. And what happens is both the strict sort of categories and the strict sort of values both melt away, right? Then they kind of just become this thing where it's like, oh, well, it's not about the numbers and in the categories, it's about what the lived experience would be like. So if you got a place where the government presence is really, really high, you would expect lots of checkpoints, lots of places where people are, having to register or things like that. That's what you would physically see in the world. So then that's where, again, it's like, does it really matter whether it's a 5 anymore? What matters is that there are checkpoints all over the place, right? Or you need to get a pass to go from one side of the city to the other or something like that. And you play the world, you do a different world building exercise with different people or same exact people, and you may find yourself interpreting the values and interpreting the categories very differently.
I was going to say this reminds me a lot of D&D for two reasons, or really any tabletop role-playing game. And it's funny because you and I have talked a lot about how this isn't really a game. It's
Yeah.
not designed to be played like a card game is. It's meant to be sort of a scaffold you use for creative writing or storytelling. But there are two things that really stand out. One of them is when you talked a little bit about the numbers and the way that those determine what end of the spectrum a particular part of society might be on in terms of prevalence versus absence. There's something there about the way that we allocate points for stats in Dungeons and Dragons,
Yeah.
right? Like if you have your character with their intellect and their wisdom and their charisma and their dexterity, et cetera, those numbers in the context of Dungeons and Dragons or similar tabletop role-playing games often matter a lot because you're using dice to determine things and you basically are the math is what's constraining your thinking about how a particular thing can happen. So
Right.
if your character has a 6 in intelligence, they're probably just below average for the normal sentient being in that world. Whereas if they're at a 16 for intelligence, they're incredibly intelligent relative to other people in the world. And that's
Right.
negotiable, but it's much more limited how far you
Right.
can push the boundaries because the math has to math correctly.
Right.
Whereas
Correct.
what we're doing here, you don't have to worry about the mathing. There is no math to do. You're just using these as sort of a guideline in the words
Vibes.
of Captain Barbosa. Yeah, Captain Barbosa's it's just vibes really. So that's, I think, an important element of this that overlaps a little bit with TTRPGs. The other element of it is every time I've done a D&D campaign or a Vaesen campaign or some other tabletop role-playing game, the numbers do start to go away after a while. You don't think as much about them. You do need to take them into account for things like combat, but for all intents and purposes, it becomes about the character you've crafted. And now you're
Correct.
just
Yeah.
thinking about what are the dynamics of this character? How do they fit into their world? What are their social relationships with the other characters in our adventuring party? And that's kind of how I think about the second piece of this. Like when we get to part two and we're talking about the ways that you color in those details or that you apply a genre lens to the world
Hmm.
or you find like all of that starts to remove the necessity of the numbers and really you're just thinking through, okay, we've come up with this cool scaffold. What do we drop on top of it to make it look nice? And
Yeah.
kind of the same way that if you've gone to Disney World and you've been on Space Mountain, the way that it looks when you have the lights on in that chamber is quite different than when
Yeah.
they have
Right.
all the effects going, right? So what we're talking about is building the roller coaster in this first part. And in part two, we're going to put in all the aesthetic values that are going to make this thing look like a crafted,
Polished. Yeah.
interesting, polished universe. And then when we get to part three and we add characters, the goal of that will be to look at how would an individual person operating in this world fall in between all of these various substructures that we're talking about. They serve as sort of the intersectional weather vanes for what's
Yeah.
going on in this world. And you can come up with a various plots and stories or whatever as you're thinking through the various different kinds of people who might exist in this universe. So I appreciate you giving us that little preview of what this will look like. Now, I've actually dealt out the cards on my desk. You all can't see them because this is an audio format, which is, I guess, a failing of podcasts, but Trent can't see them either. So I'm just going to read out the values as they are dealt. But what I thought we could do is go category by category or structure by structure. So it can be overwhelming to think about 14 different substructures all at once. So I don't want to just deal them all out and then go back and start talking about them without discussing them in sort of a methodical way. So we'll go through government, economics, social or cultural relations, and then finally the cultural influences category, and then work through the substructures underneath each of those umbrellas based on the numbers that are dealt out. And I don't really intend, I don't know if you were thinking about this way, but I don't really intend to get into the nitty gritty of like what kind of world should we be building as we're doing this. I
Yeah.
kind of want to just talk about what could the numbers mean for each of these categories and then offload that next piece to part two, where we really start thinking through, okay, how are these interacting and what do we interpret that to mean for the world that we're building?
That sounds good.
Okay.
And the other thing I'll just throw in there real quickly too is that we've got another, I don't know what it is, 9 categories that you could swap in and out. So this is something too in which I'll say in my classes, like if young women are tired of gender inequality, well, and you just want to have a gender equal world, well, you could either give that a 5 or you could swap that out for something else, right? And there's like age and ableism and non-humans, and other kinds of categories. And basically what you're trying to do is figure out what are the prevalent ones, what are the ones that is less equality, right? And it's the same thing. I've heard, no, I've not, I mean, I don't know much about teaching under the age of 18, but I've been told by educators too that they've been able to use the same system with younger kids, and what they do is they scaffold it, in which they'll do one card for each category, and then they'll do another card for each category and talk about it. And so it's
Yeah.
much slower. Whereas when I'm doing this with adults, with college students, I like the chaos of just being like, all 14 of them are out here, right? And like, who sees, and like literally, you've got a group of 4 or 5 people hunched over a table. Who sees what here? What are the possible connections, right? So it's not like
It's our secularist form of divination, I
yeah,
think.
exactly,
Something like that.
exactly. The I Ching. But yeah, and that's the whole thing. Is like there is no right or wrong answer, and what you'll get a lot of, and why it's fun to watch as well as at the instructor, is someone will say something, and then everyone goes, "Ooh, that's a great," you know what I mean? That's a great interpretation. Or it's especially happens with the trending, where it's like, well, what if instead of this trending up, it starts trending down because of whatever, and then everyone's like, "Oh, that's awesome," right? So it's supposed to be kind of squishy and moldable, malleable, and then over time, as people start bringing more and more interpretations to it, then it starts to harden a little bit more, right? And it becomes like, okay, we're getting a clear indication of the way that this world operates. Like, and this is where I always kind of say too, is that what you want to be thinking about is what would daily life be like for a person, right? This is where we'll get into the subjective part, but just generally speaking, what would daily life look like if you were walking through this world, is kind of the thing that we're trying to get at.
Okay, great. So we're going to start with that first category or structure. That's government. I've shuffled these cards in my hand. Again, I don't know what order they're in. Trent has not seen them. There's no tricks, no foul play here. We're just going to start with government presence. And again, we'll do each category one at a time. So government consists of government presence, rule of law, and social services. So as we deal the cards, we'll explain a little bit about what that substructure means and how we might think about the specific number that was dealt to it. So here we go. Drum roll. Insert the drum roll noise. This is where we're going to put a drum roll sound effect.
Okay, I don't need to pound.
Maybe. Okay, ready? We got a 5. We got a 5 for our first category, government presence. So you already used this example. Just really quickly to go back over it, do you want to explain a little bit how you might interpret or think about explaining this to a student group, for instance?
Yeah, so the exact opposite would be sort of the post-apocalypse where there is no government, anywhere anyone can see. That would be sort of like what a 1 would be. So a 5 is going to mean that there is some obvious input from the government all the time, everywhere, right? And that may be nefarious, or it may be trying to help. But the idea being is that people living in this world are going to be seeing traces of the government in all aspects of their life, like all the time, right? So this is a really strong, it doesn't get any stronger than this, that the government will be involved. And again, we'll hold off. It may be a good thing, it may be a bad thing, but we'll have to see how the rest of these go.
Yeah, I was actually thinking maybe it'd be helpful too to give some examples from other media we've read that might fit this category. And obviously the first one that comes to mind is the Empire in Star Wars, or I guess you could say the same thing of Sauron and his armies in Lord of the Rings, right? I mean, it's kind of, if you narrow the lens to focus on
Mordor,
if you focus on the world of Mordor, it might be a 5. What are some other ones that come to mind for you when you think of a 5?
Minority Report. The whole idea of having like precogs who can understand that there's going to be crimes that are happening. Definitely Handmaid's Tale, again, is another great one. A lot of dystopian and not really post-apocalyptic, but mostly dystopian literature, I think.
I was going to say there's obviously a connection here with Orwell's 1984.
Yep.
It'd be interesting to think about this in terms of not specifically a 5 for government presence, but something like a Brave New World, where the government isn't necessarily the thing that's causing people to disengage or to allow authoritarianism to happen. It's just sort of an absence of desire to do other things. It'd be an interesting one to kind of map out.
Yeah. I'd say too, like a lot of those have been negative, right? But you could see about how if you have a tribal community, if you had people who were, they live in long houses together, and there is the government is the people, right? I could see how that would also be like every move that you're making in a world like that could be construed as political, right? If you are that sort of married and you don't really sort of have a civic versus a political side, right? You've just got the one. So that could be one too, in which a community is super, super close knit, in which every action has political ramifications. And again, this is where already we're starting to get into the questions of like, well, how is this New York City, or would this be a podunk, village out in the middle of nowhere? And it's like, well, we don't have that information to go on. But that's where, as we start to get more of these these numbers, then different interpretations tend to sort of lend themselves. So let's see what the next one is.
Yeah, I'm going to add one other quick positive example. The Smurfs. Wouldn't the
Yeah, there
Smurfs
you go.
qualify as a five? I think
Absolutely.
that's probably an
Absolutely.
interesting example. Or the commune that exists in The Last of Us when Ellie and Joel get to his brother and they're all
Yeah.
living in that compound together. It's actually a communist structured government, so
Yeah.
that would potentially be a five as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Rule of law. Rule of law. Here we go. We got a 3 for rule of law. So why don't you give us a rundown of what rule of law is and what a 3 might be?
Yeah, so rule of law is basically how are laws codified, how are they enforced, who decides who is judge, jury, and potentially executioner in this world, where a 5 would be, very, very tight policing, absolutely everywhere. A 1 would be absence. And I guess it's a good thing to come back and say that this would be government funded, right? Like this is where a lot of times if people have a 1 if students are building their worlds and they have a 1 in rule of law, then it's like, oh well, you can hire your own police force, right? But the government's not doing it for you. But would you be expecting a fair trial? And this is also where it's sort of fun to be like, well, what do you think our world is? Like, what do you think the world of, the United States or a certain part of the United States? We know our justice system isn't perfect. So then where would you put it on that scale? So for here, it's sort of like right in the middle, meaning to me, that would mean it's not extraordinary, right? It's not something that people would have on their minds the first day they walk down the street. If they got off the train in this world, that wouldn't be the first thing that they would notice. They would notice the government checkpoint, but they wouldn't necessarily notice baton-toting police or anything like that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because this is one of the ones my students would struggle with a lot because they would think, especially if we were doing an evaluation of real places, right? Because like you said, most people, depending on the circumstances, don't really spend their time worrying about the rule of law. And that paired with a 5 in government presence makes it sound like the government's not utilizing the state to punish people for any particular reason. But as you were saying, that doesn't necessarily mean the government, depending on what happens with the rest of the deal, the government might be working in cahoots with economic or corporate interests. And so
Yeah.
the utility of rule of law to the government might not be that significant if there are these other interests that they're collaborating with in order to enforce a certain kind of society. So
Yeah.
I mean, that's an interesting one just to kind of mull over. How do you have a very invasive government that isn't making itself overtly known through the police or the court system?
Right.
Do you think of rule of law as being about equity under the law? Like the social status and the social and gender and race constructs, I kind of think more about in terms of equality, but rule of law also has its own quality of, well, how is somebody who's very wealthy versus somebody who's very poor treated by the court system? Or maybe there's some other dimension that I'm not thinking about.
That's where I would start. Once we deal out all of the cards, that's where I would start looking and being like, if we've got, low levels of equality, then it's like, oh, well, rule of law. Well, who's being, who the bias is against who? Well, it's whoever gets low numbers in our social relations is the way that I would think about it. Or like, if you've got a very high religion, for example, then maybe it's from people who are outside, would be tried more harshly. Whereas if you had a 5 in rule of law, right, then it would be not only would it be very prominent, but you could also interpret that to mean it's also very fair. So this I would think is like, oh, well, this is kind of lumpy, like our justice system is right now. Not the worst, not the best, and just sort of in the middle. So probably not something, but again, if it turns out that we start dealing the cards out and this is one of the trending categories, then you got to decide, is it becoming more or less? Like, is the government taking more interest, or are they washing their hands of rule of law?
Just going back to the example of if you have a 5 in government presence and they are working, the government itself, the state has organized itself to support economic interests. The first thing that came to mind was BioShock, where you might actually have a 3 in rule of law, because it's not, the entire premise of BioShock is that this is this uber libertarian society that has moved under the ocean so that these people can live without government interference at all. But if that's all in service of corporate interests, then it de facto becomes the state. So
Right.
there's an interesting way you could kind of read these numbers. And this maybe is a good example of how the numbers don't really mean much. They're just an opportunity to discuss what might lead to this sort of organization.
Yeah, and that's what I'd say too. I've got some students who are working on a cyberpunk world, and that was one of the things that they thought about right off the bat is government and rule of law. They're like, well, the corporations are sort of, in cyberpunk in that genre tend to be take the place of the government. So what do we do? And I'm like, you do whatever you want to do, right? Like what I would do is deal them out and decide, is it a puppet government? Does the government not even exist? Whatever. Is like the government just consisting of corporations? Any of those would be fine. But just, again, like I might be saying to you, just deal it out and we'll figure it out as it goes along.
One other quick example is maybe some Western genre stuff where I specifically was thinking of Red Dead Redemption, where the law or the government is present in that it's a small town in the Old West and the sheriff is the one who decides what's legal and what's not. So I think you could justifiably read that into these cards. It's a quasi-communist kind of area that is run. I don't even know what that's not the right way to describe it, but the Old West does strike me as the law would be known, the state would be present, and it would be obvious, but the law might not be enforced equally.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Number 3, social services. For social services, we got a 4. So that's also pretty high.
So again, this is for this first category, this first structure of government governance. Social services would be, what are the things like education, healthcare, transportation, infrastructure? What is the government providing? So in this case, it's quite high, right? So this means that you'd probably expect to see public schooling, some sort of healthcare, right? And again, this could go back to, if we're talking about a tribal community or something, maybe these social services are just knit into the fabric of that society, and the people who live in that society wouldn't even understand what it would mean to separate those, because that's just what your government does, right? But it's those kinds of things in which the society is going to look after the other members of the society is sort of the way that and it can be any kind of looking out for other people, where it's either, the low end would be there's no schooling, everybody's on their own, and a 5 being, so a 4 is quite high, being that people are quite well looked after. And again, you could ask yourself, what is the United States, or what is, I'm in Rochester, New York, like what is Rochester in terms of social services, as opposed to someplace in, say, Texas, right? You know what I mean? Like, so you can start thinking about it. Although I was going to mention this earlier, that I find that using the numbers works better in fictional or alternate sort of histories, alternate worlds, whereas we're better off when we're describing our own world, because no one wants to ever go to any of the extremes in our own world. They always want to hang around 2s, 3s, and 4s, right? And it's like, that's fine, but it makes the point better if we can have some of those extremes and then mellow them out through sort of the narrative that we're describing. But
I feel like alternate history is a really good way to do that. When I worked with my students on this, I had the same issue. They would sort of gravitate toward 2, 3s, and 4s because they didn't want to make a decision that they knew there would be some counterexample to. Whereas in a speculative world or in an alternate history, there is no countervailing way to understand the world. Everybody's kind of imagining or projecting onto it whatever they want. And so when you use the numbers in this way, you're allowed to take a firmer stance on what the world must be, because you don't know all the counterexamples that might have existed in that world to say this number wouldn't be justifiable.
Yeah.
I also thought when, getting a high number for social services, the first place my mind went was, like the Nordic countries seem like places that probably have a 4 for their social services. Trying to think of some other examples you had used when we initially wrote the book, and I think this example survived into the final version, the notion that healthcare and education aren't necessarily positives either. So when it comes to the moral valencing of this, just because it's a high number doesn't mean it's good. So in the context of The Handmaid's Tale was the one we had used in the book, having really good education distribution or healthcare availability is not necessarily, just because it's there does not necessarily mean it's good for everybody. If that healthcare is used to provide fertilization treatments to people who don't want them, or the education system is really indoctrination, just because those things have high availability doesn't necessarily mean that they are quote unquote good. So do you have any other examples of a world that might have a 4 for social services? I'm trying to come up with one.
Well, most utopians, I would say, so like, The Dispossessed, Ursula Le Guin's excellent novel that is sort of a look at utopia, dystopia. I would think in a lot of utopian novels. But then again, it's the thing too, like if you've got the kids that are being rounded up and they have to, sing a fascist song before school or whatever. I can't quite think of a good example off the top of my head, but that would be a case too, in which it's like, oh, well, everybody's being educated, but they're being miseducated, right? So just having it present doesn't necessarily mean that it's good.
Now that you mention it, I feel like Avatar: The Last Airbender would be a really useful framework for understanding a lot of these things, because depending on which part of the world
Right.
you're looking at or which nation you're looking at, you're going to be able to identify some of these things. And so social services, I would say, is actually probably quite high for all the nations, but the way that it is provided is quite different for all of
Right.
them. The Fire
Right.
Nation versus the Water Nation, or the Water Tribes versus the Earth Nation, like their idea of what good social services are quite different. And I
Right.
think if you're kind of struggling with conceptualizing how a four could be good and bad, or could be, could mean multiple different kinds of things, that might be a good place to start looking, in
Yeah.
addition to sort of at our real
That
reality.
that idea of scope is really important. Like, how are we
Mhm.
talking about, if we were talking about our sort of geography, is this a state that we're talking about, or is it a city, or is it,
Mhm.
like, because we're world building, we've talked about these different levels, right? It's almost like zooming in and out using a telescope or a microscope or something like that. And that's one of the questions, is what level are we talking about here, right? Is
Mhm.
this a city, or is this a, region, whatever it is? And the answer, of course, is we don't know yet. We haven't decided. So
Intentionally not decided for the
intentionally not
moment.
decided, yeah.
Okay, that brings us to the end of our first structural category, government. We're going to move on to the second structural category now, which is economics, and that is broken into three substructures. We have economic strength, agriculture and trade, and wealth distribution. So just a few minutes ago, we were talking about what if the government is in cahoots with the corporations. We're about to find out. So
Yeah.
here we go. We're going to look at economic strength, and for that, we have gotten a two.
A
So we have a
two.
two for economic strength. Quite low. It's our first lowish number.
Yep. Yeah, so for that, obviously that would mean that throughout the entire world, there's not a lot of wealth, however you want to define that, which we will again have to defer until we get the world built a little bit more. But yeah, just the idea that even the people who are the best off in this world probably don't have a lot, right? So you may be
Mhm.
a sultan in the middle of the desert or something like that, right? And you may have more water than anybody else, but that's not going to get you very far if you travel to Fifth Avenue, right, and try and buy something
Mhm.
expensive. So it's again all relative, but yeah, two being under, if three is sort of the median value, then you'd think about this as being a somewhat impoverished world.
Hmm. The first thing my brain went to was the Matrix.
Hmm.
If you were looking at the human civilization in the
Hmm.
Matrix, although that might actually be closer to a
Yeah, I
one,
was
where
going to
there
say
is
that
no
might be a
real
one,
economy. So
right?
maybe a step above that. Maybe some of the planets in Star Wars would
Yeah,
fit the bill
yeah,
here,
yeah.
like, various hot planets, or something like Jeddah or
Hmm.
Tatooine, right? Like
Hmm.
they're fairly impoverished. The wealth distribution is, or there is economic strength, but it's not particularly grandiose compared to certain parts of the galaxy, right? If you're in the Hutt Palace on Tatooine, it's quite a bit different than being in the Emperor's Palace on Coruscant. So
Yeah,
I guess we'll have to see what our wealth distribution ultimately looks like to make some
right,
decisions there.
right, right.
All right, let's move on to the next one, agriculture and trade, which I think is sort of self-explanatory.
Yep.
For that, we got a four. So we got
Okay.
some pretty decent agriculture and trade despite having relatively low economic strength. So why don't you give us a rundown of that one?
Yeah, so this is one too in which, if people often say, can we break these two because they are different things? And the answer is, well, yeah, of course, you can do whatever you want, whatever makes sense for you working on this world. But the idea being is there's some, and I've swapped out before natural resources or something. So there's something of value that's in this world. And I mean, the way that I would read this, and again, this is already just like an interpretation, economic strength being two and agriculture and trade being a four would suggest to me that they're not making absolute, this society is not making as much money on the resources. They're not generating enough wealth based on the resources that they may have, right? And it could just be that they're not interested in generating wealth. Like if they are sustaining
That's a great
themselves
point.
and,
Yeah.
whatever, you've got all the wheat you want and you got, you can feed everybody, then maybe you don't need to be that rich and you can be perfectly happy. And this is where too, like, an outsider who comes into this world could be like, but you don't have gold and you don't have what, you don't have these other elements. And it's like,
Hmm.
well, why do we need them? Why do we want them? Because we've got everything that we need. So, yeah, so I mean, that's where already with a five in government presence, a four in social services, a two in economic strength, a four in agriculture and trade, to me, this is feeling like, okay, this is like a self-sufficient community that, it could be on a lunar base, it could be, wherever. But that's kind of where my head is going, just looking at the, or, another great one is the expanse. I don't know if you've seen The Expanse, but so
Yeah.
you've got the Earth, you've got Mars. Earth is just Earth. Mars is very, very militaristic and warlike, which you could see in these numbers. And then the Belters are not well off, but they make ends meet more or less. But they're always kind of in a precarious situation. So that could be something similar in which there's no real worry in The Expanse that they're necessarily going to starve to death, but they're not being kept in luxury by any stretch of the imagination.
Okay. Actually, before we move on, the first thing I thought of when you said moon base or the expanse was actually Dune, because I
Oh
think
yeah,
if you
yeah,
looked at Arrakis itself, that might be justifiably a place. There's obviously very high government presence. The rule of law is, sort of middling and
yep.
not enforced in a way that I think would be on either extremity. The social services are probably about a four. And
Hmm.
then for economic strength, the planet itself is not super wealthy, but it has a very valuable resource. Although in
Right,
that case, I might actually expect that, Arrakis or the story of Dune would be a five in agriculture or trade.
right,
And wealth
right.
distribution would be really important too, because I think whether that money is shared by the larger group or is aggregated to one person in the group or
Yeah,
one smaller organization to make a huge difference as to whether or not this actually maps to the world of Arrakis.
yeah.
Okay, now we're going to move on to wealth distribution. Let's see what we get here.
Exciting.
You want to guess?
No.
It's a three.
It's a three. Okay, so another middling value, which to me would sort of suggest some clear class distinctions between the very poor, the working class, having a middle class, sort of an upper middle class, and then maybe an elite class. That would suggest to me that's what I think through lots of different societies you kind of have that striated structure. So that's what I would see with a three. What about you?
I think that's probably about right. As I'm thinking about economic strength, agriculture and trade, and wealth distribution with these specific numbers, I kind of imagine I don't know what the right term would be. A developing country is
Yeah,
the
could
first
be.
thing I would like. Not impoverished, but not the height of economic power, somewhere in the middle.
Yeah,
There are obviously a number of real world examples you could use for this, but in general, I think wealth
yeah,
distribution in this case, especially in a world that has such high government presence, I can imagine the government, in this case, I would say the government is not necessarily in cahoots with the corporate
yeah,
interests of this
yeah.
world. Because if you were using the levers of government or the state, you could make a lot of money doing something, but it seems like that's not a priority of this particular society. I'm trying to think of any other worlds, fictional or otherwise, that I might say has I mean, if you looked at Star Wars broadly, and this kind of goes
Broadly,
back to the
yeah,
problem of how big is the scope, this is something my students would do all the time when we said, well, what is the United States wealth distribution? And I think
right.
that is probably easier to point to, like, well, it's not good. So in that case, it's probably somewhere not
Yeah,
around a three, whether you want to argue that it would be higher or lower. But if you zoom out far enough and say, what is the wealth distribution of all of North America or the entire planet, you end up averaging out to a three because you're taking too much data and aggregating it, and then basically everything comes
right.
out in the middle.
Middle.
So I think that's probably what I would point to is, like, if you looked at the Star Wars galaxy, it probably has a wealth distribution of three because
Yeah,
you're averaging across all of these different societies, cultures, civilizations,
right.
whatever. And it's like,
And
okay,
you
well,
could look, I mean, I would say too, like even just walking downtown in a lot of cities in the United States, you're going to see some homeless people. You're going to see some people who are wearing business suits, fancy jewelry, whatever. And then there's a whole bunch of people who are somewhere between those two of just being like
yeah.
visually representing. Whereas, if it were much worse, then you'd think you'd see lots of destitute people and people, you'd start thinking about some of the poorest areas in the world, like where it's like, okay, well, if there's any money, nobody has it here, right? Or everybody looks fit, everybody seems to be, well, at least dressed decently, all those kind of things. So just being able to see evidence that it is neither extreme is also kind of like what a three might be, right?
This is a really stupid example, but as you're describing that, I thought, oh, it's Springfield in The
Yeah,
Simpsons,
yeah,
right? You
right.
you walk down the street and you see both extremes. There's Mr. Burns, and then
Yep,
there's the Simpsons themselves, which I think Homer even at one point described as upper lower middle class types, which
yep.
feels very three to me. And then on the far end, you have this is so stupid. It's such a specific niche thing to know, but like there's the episode with the two guys with feathers underneath the bridge who are both hobos.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But
Or
it's
Homer's brother when he comes back to town after he's gone broke because Homer developed the Homer car.
right, right. Well, I was going to say though, that's a good in that you brought up it's not like this isn't supposed to be an average, right? So if you've got five
Right.
ones and five fives, it doesn't average out to be a three, right? It's like no, 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 no. It's supposed to be that it's a middle value, right? Like maybe the
Mhm.
median or the mode or whatever
A
value.
suburb. It is the
Yeah,
suburb
it
of
is a suburb.
values,
Yeah,
right?
the
That's
median is
our,
the average. I do know that. I just wanted to say that real quickly. So
well, the median and the average aren't the same thing. The median is the middle, and the average is what you get if you add everything up and divide. It's a
okay,
different value. It's
all
a,
right.
never mind. Okay. Category or structure number 4. This is where we get into our social issues, which, this is a big opportunity for everybody to go woke or go broke.
Yep.
And our 4 different substructures within this category consist of race relations, class relations, gender relations, and sexual orientation relations. And as Trent mentioned before, you can swap these out or you can include additional ones like age and ableism. So if you want to think about what is disability like in this particular world that you're developing, that could be really interesting. And there's also non-humans. So if you were dealing with, for instance, going back to Tolkien or maybe something like World of Warcraft, where you have different kinds of sentient beings, humanoid beings, you might draw that card into this as well and try to figure out how are things being divided between the dwarves and the elves and the trolls and the orcs and such.
Yeah. One of those things too that in these categories, like it was important for me because I do a lot of work in science fiction and fantasy to be able to separate. So D&D, your race is actually your species, right? So you're an actual
Mm-hmm.
different kind of being, and they just call that all race. And it's like, but there are like in Tolkien, there are the wood elves, and there are it's
Mm-hmm.
like there are different specific species or ethnicities that are within or different ethnicities or races within a species. So I
Yeah.
think it's really valuable to sort of separate those two. The other one would be AI, robots, you know what I mean? Something along
Mm-hmm.
those lines. Like, are we treating C3PO and R2D2 like fully, human beings, or are they treated like property?
All right, so let's deal our next number here. I'm going to start with race relations, and then again, we'll rotate through them. All right, here we go. We got
Because
a
they're
3.
okay. So race relations are a three, and I was going to say that they're all more or less the same thing. Like I tend to race relations and then equality. So what else? When we go through all of these, it's like the race equality, the class equality, the gender
Mhm.
equality, the sexual orientation or sexual identity equality. But why don't you deal these out, and then we'll talk about the 4 of them rather than doing them one by one because they're
Okay,
pretty much the
yeah,
same thing.
that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we did race relations. That's a 3. For class relations, we have a 5.
Okay.
For gender relations, we have a 3.
Okay.
And then for sexual orientation relations, we have a 4.
A 4. So now, having done this so many times, we've got a bunch of low numbers that are lurking around. Our culture is going to be bottoming out, but let's not go there yet. Okay, so we've got a 3 in race, a 5 in class, a 3 in gender, and a 4 in sexual orientation or identity. So looking at these, right? Again, that same idea that it doesn't really seem like any of like obviously race and gender are not perfect, which would mean that it would be notable, perhaps, right? There could be features of this society in which people were not treated equally. The
Mhm.
other big one that I think trips students up quite a bit is that class doesn't necessarily need to be economic class or just economic class, right? It could be a class of, you've got a caste system, or you've got the clergy, and you've got the military, and you've got the merchants, right? And those are all social classes rather than economic classes. But yeah, for this, so then whatever's going on in this world, right? It's the government is heavily involved. Social services are quite high, and class is something that they really want to flatten, right? I don't know, we don't know why yet, but absolutely, it's something that they want to make sure that there is absolute equality regardless of your walk of life.
My first read of this with class relations and sexual orientation relations both being higher, or at least different than race relations and gender relations, make me think that class and sexual orientation in this world are probably intertwined in some way, that those
Hmm.
two things, if they're not if they're not the same thing, they at least correspond with one another or correlate with one another in some way. I'm trying to think of an example of a world like that where you might see something along these lines. I'll have to think more about that.
Yeah.
That's a tricky one. And then if you were to look back a little bit, so we still have high government presence, we have high agriculture and trade, we had relatively high social services. Maybe these things are intertwined as well. And when we were thinking about rule of law being somewhere in the middle where maybe it's not enforced equally for all people, maybe we start to see some of this happening with the class and sexual orientation components. So those are our four social substructures. And finally, we have our fourth and final category or structure, which is cultural influences. And do you want to do these separately, or do you think we should do the same thing we just did? Because I feel like these are all pretty distinct from one another.
I
So
think so too. I mean, I think they're kind of self-explanatory. So yeah, let's just rip through them and describe them because it's pretty much the same thing. Not again, not a value system, just sort of a is this a lot or a little? So the first one is religion, and I always like to say too when I'm teaching my class that it's like if the cultural influence is really high, then that would suggest to me that that would have an impact on the physical environment, right? So if you've got a really high religious influence, then you're going to see lots of temples, lots of places of worship, lots of, whatever it is. That's just what you would see moving through that world. And if it's military, then you'd see military outposts and training facilities, and all those kind of things. And you could think about, just traveling throughout the United States, whenever there's an army base that you're going through, it's pretty evident that there's an army base there, right? And it's the same thing as you go further south. Churches become much more prevalent as we head south in the United States as they are in, the Northeast is the most secular, the Southeast is the most religious, right? So you could just drive north to south and see how the environment changes, right? In terms of culture.
you want to mention the other three? So we have religious influence.
Yep, military influence. I kind of already did by accident. Military influence, which would just again would be are you going past a military base? Technology influence. So one of the having lived in Washington State and Seattle for a while, like when you're over in Redmond and Bellevue, you can't help but see there's technology all over the place. And then the last one is art and culture, which would encompass a lot of things: cuisine, performing arts, and just sort of like generally speaking. Like this is one of the things too. As we get to the end of this, I always use the Athens and Sparta kind of example. One was hardcore military, the other one was hardcore arts and culture, right? Like that's they're close geographically, but they're quite distinct culturally, largely because of that. I mean, there's a bunch of different things, but that is probably the number one thing that people would use to distinguish those two.
It's kind of funny because as you're saying all of that, I immediately thought, oh, this is just how you win Civ. If you're playing a game of Civilization, these are the four categories that kind of exist for you to win Civilization, right? Okay, so we'll do them in that order. We have religious influence, military influence, technology influence, and arts and culture influence. And as you said, given the previous draws we've gotten, I expect this is going to be a pretty strange world we've crafted here.
Yep.
All right, our religious influence is a 1.
A 1.
So we finally drew our first 1. Our next one is our military influence, which is a 2.
Okay.
So no strong military in this particular world we're building. Number 3, we have our technology influence, which is also a 2.
Okay.
Which means that our arts and culture influence is a 1.
A 1. Interesting. All right. So the arts and the whole cultural influences are quite low. That's interesting. So, what I would think with this, number one is right off the top of my head, I'm like, oh, well, this seems like a hippie commune that's out in the middle of the desert. They don't want to have any religious beliefs. They don't really even want to deal with art and culture, right? Just kind of, you're out there, you're living by yourself. You want to be left alone. You probably have as much military and as much technology as you need and not anything more. Whereas technology and then expression, maybe it's Footloose. Maybe it's the little town from Footloose where dancing is not allowed, right? Something along those lines where and then again we'll have to fold this back in to how does this work with a government that is so strong with social services and all those things. Why would they be not helping or not sort of supporters of religion, arts and culture, military, and technology? What's your read on that?
So I actually, as you were talking, I just Googled this because I was trying to make sure that I was correct. But you know that television commercial that Apple Macintosh did back in the 1984 style commercial they did? That was released in 1983 and 1984 based on Orwell's book 1984. But that's kind of what I thought of, is the world of everybody looking at Big Brother on the screen. And they're all just facing forward. Everything is sort of dull and black and white or grayscale. And I don't know that that's necessarily the best interpretation of this. It's just the first one that came to mind. I do find it really interesting that you would have low military influence but very high government presence. So I think you're right. It probably does need to be some sort of communal society. But that's also surprising because you would think that in a society that was so communal, you would have arts and culture.
Right.
Which makes me wonder, do you think about arts and culture influence as being the absence? I mean, when we say absence versus extreme presence of a thing, does that mean that it's absence of diversity of arts and culture or absence of arts at all?
I
Because
would say
I think,
absence of arts at all. Like it's just not
okay,
something. It's your three square rations of gray gruel every day, right?
yeah.
There is no Saturday night sock hop, right? Like there's no theatrical productions. So sorry, I mean that there is part of that. Coming back to Le Guin's Dispossessed. This is one of the things in which there's socialist sort of, quote unquote utopia. The artists have a really hard time because they want to be able to critique and use, art to be able to push back against power. But it's also their whole system is predicated on power being distributed. You know what I mean? So it's one of those things that it's like, well, you can't have the naysayer. So the short way of saying it is somebody's utopia is somebody else's dystopia and vice versa.
I think the other example I would point to, and tell me if you think I'm wrong about this, but Shirley Jackson's The Lottery might
Oh
fit
yeah.
this world that we've just thrown out here because
Austere, yeah.
it's sort of austere. It never really talks about arts and culture. It's not about militarism or technology. You could argue that a religious influence should be higher for that because of the way that story twists. On the other hand, I would say that's more of a government presence issue
Right,
than it is a
right.
religious one because it's not a cult, right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
more of this is a
A
tradition that we've
practice,
written into
yeah.
our role or our rule set for this world, our constitution. Like this is a
Yep.
tradition that is somewhat secular, not just baked into some religious practice.
Yeah. As you say that, and I mean, of course, we got to deal out the trendings too, because that could change
Mhm.
things. That will change things. But this does seem to me to be if we all follow the rules, we'll get along better. And don't step out of line. We're going to, monitor to make sure that everybody is being respectful. And oh yeah, maybe we're not perfect with race, and maybe we're not perfect with gender, but we're trying, right? So let's see how these trending cards work out, because that could be, again, if we have this low category for cultural influences and then they're all trending, that would be so. Just so you know, too, for people who are listening, if you have a 5, you can still be trending up towards a hypothetical 6, where it's just like
Mhm.
it is off the rails, right? It is really, really strong, and they're trying to figure out how to make it even stronger. And a
Mhm.
1 trending down to a 0, I always tend to think about is like the attempted eradication, right? So that's where
Mm.
if you have a 1 in art and culture and it's trending down, then that means they're like actively trying to root out arts and culture in this society.
Another idea that popped into my head just now is puritanical New England,
Yeah.
except that religious influence would obviously be a 5 in that case. But I think for the most part, the rest of this could kind of fit in. I mean, class relations, I think, would be a little wonky because it was much more socialist because it
Yeah.
was basically
Well,
driven by the religious community. But
yeah.
and we actually talk about that in the book too. The first school laws were in Massachusetts Bay Colony. Like there are a bunch
Yeah.
of other things. But if you think
It's
about class in terms of who has political influence, like maybe that does matter because our government presence is really high. I don't know. That was
right,
another
right.
Hester Prynne and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Scarlet
I,
Letter popped into my
I
head.
actually thought about that too. It's sort of like if New England had been settled instead of pilgrims, if it had been settled by Marxists, right? And wouldn't we all be happier today? So, anyway,
That's our full deck. Now I have the trending and stable cards here. What I'm going to do is I will just go across the entire 14 substructures one at a time, flipping them over, and I'll just say which thing each one is. And I'll be
yep,
curious to see whether or not some of our middling values end up being trending, because I feel like that could do a lot to change or knock some of
yep,
this
yep,
off kilter from what we were
yeah,
originally
yeah.
imagining.
Only one way to find out. Stop
Only
talking and
only
deal
one
the
way. I'm
card.
gonna be the Vanna White with the cards.
All right.
I'm pandering. All right. This one's fun. The first deal, government presence is trending. So we have a
Okay.
5 that is trending either up or down. And as you said, just because it's at the cap doesn't mean it can't go higher and become even more invasive. It
Yep.
just becomes crazy extreme at that point.
Yep.
Rule of law is stable at a 3. Social services is stable at a 4. Economic strength is trending at a
Okay.
2. So that's our second trending. I like that. I like
Yep. Yep.
the juxtaposition of those two things. We have agriculture and trade, remember, was a 4, and that is stable. So our resources aren't depleting. Wealth distribution at a 3 is trending. So our wealth distribution is
Okay.
either worsening or improving.
Ooh, yeah.
All right. So there's only one more trending left in here, right?
Yep.
So let's see which one it's going to be. Will it be race relations? Nope, it's not. That's stable. Let's see. Do we get our class relations? Nope, that's stable. How about our gender relations? Also stable. And now our sexual orientation relations is stable. So the
Okay.
entire social influences category,
Right.
social
Well, I'm
issues
excited.
category. All right. Now, which of our desperately low cultural influence categories is going to get it? Let's see. It's not religious influence. That's stable at a
All
1.
right.
It's It's not military
Oh
influence.
my
That's
God.
stable at a 2,
Okay.
which means we're doing either tech or arts and culture,
All
and it
right.
looks like it's going to be technology
All
is our
right.
trending. So our
Fascinating.
technology is trending. Our four trending categories: government presence, economic strength, wealth distribution, and technology influence.
Awesome. All right. I'm excited.
What comes to mind for you given this array of cards?
All right. So first, and this is where too, like if I were doing this in a group or whatever, I would be like, okay, I'm excited because what I think happens is somebody comes up with some technology that allows them to extract their resources more efficiently, which allows them to have more money. And the fact that they're going to be getting
Hmm.
rich really fast means it upsets the wealth distribution, right? So it's like it's already
Hmm.
becoming lumpy and uneven. And then the government, in my reading of this, would want to go from a 5 to a hypothetical 6, where they're like, we need more
Right.
power than ever because things are going to get unequal if we don't. And we're super important. We really care about making sure that our equalities are good and this sudden influx. So I was thinking too, like you were saying with the trending for agriculture and trade or a natural resource, this would be like striking gold or striking oil in the middle of a previously poor
Hmm.
town, right? Like some old man Withers is going to get super rich, right? And everybody's going to want a piece of it. So that's what I think. What are you looking at?
I'm thinking about. I had a very similar reaction to you. It seemed pretty obvious, and maybe it's just because we've done this a bunch of times, so
It
we've thought
is.
a lot about a lot of the permutations here. But even on its face, it just seemed sort of obvious that, like, okay, well, technology was low, and now it's getting, well, theoretically could be getting worse, but let's say it's getting better.
Yeah.
Well, okay, the technology is what destabilized the economy in some way, and that's going to affect the way the government reacts. Although, interestingly, I guess you could go the other direction where maybe this is a decaying world. So the trending could be going from a 2 to a 1 for technology.
Yeah.
Technologies, I think you could make this argument, and I think others have, about A Song of Ice and Fire, and that in some sense it was supposed to be a medieval world that grew out of a formerly prosperous and technologically advanced world after nuclear apocalypse.
Hmm.
So I could see something like that happening, which, to mention another thing that kind of came to mind, was the Enclave from Fallout.
Yeah.
Looking at this kind of gives me that vibe. Like the Enclave is very science driven. Obviously, technology would be higher than that if it were at its peak of power, but we don't know where in the timeline it is. I bet you could come up with a way to justify that the technology of that organization or that faction was improving, and at the same time, the government at that time was interrelated with the Enclave. They were all sort of one big faction, and I think you could come up with a justification that all of these things
Yeah.
could kind of work in that category or
That
that
it,
lens too.
You're absolutely right because I was thinking, if there was something that happened, like if this were a moon base or something like that, or some outpost, remote outpost, and something happens, right, whatever that is, and all of a sudden your technology you no longer have, like if it's a fuel cell or something like that, right, and you've
Mm-hmm.
just hit your last one, well, that's going to bottom out. And then the economic strength is going to bottom out. And then wealth distribution, without having a strong government, would start to get wonky, right? Would start to grow. So you would, but then the government would maybe the government presence may start diminishing because it's like, we're going to break up and everybody's got to go their own way. Everyone go to their own life shuttles, right? And this could be something that was happening really fast, right? Kind of a disaster scenario. So if technology was going down, government presence was going down, economic strength was going down, and wealth distribution was going down, right? That's a
Mm-hmm.
scene that you would want to get out of, right? So great.
Well,
No, love it.
Well, we also have our sexual orientation relations and our class relations being as high as they are. Kind of make me think, okay, this is a pre-existing problem that was either probably being created by the government
Hmm.
or that the government in its place as this really strong institutional body is trying to fix this, except it's not working. Like something is
Yeah.
stuck in the culture, in the society where those things might not be moving. Another idea I had was technology doesn't just have to be some specific tool, right? It could be that you discover something in the universe. And it made me think of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, where the conceit in that show is you have one location, it's all taking place on one specific space station, but you have all of these competing organizations, politicians, or governments, ways of looking at the universe, and then they discover this black hole that has a wormhole in it. So the
Hmm.
discovery of the wormhole itself could change the technology influence in a way that maybe it hadn't necessarily been considered before, or there's
Yeah.
some other way that this modified society or the world. And to go back to some place that we started way early on, we haven't decided on a timeline yet. So this could
Right.
be it's a black swan event that happened overnight, and we're going to have to figure out what the impact would be, or this discovery or this transition to a greater technology influence has been going on for generations. And maybe
Yeah.
some of these things are, the economic strength, the wealth distribution, the government presence, they're all trending, but they've been trending in this direction for a long time.
Planned
And maybe,
obsolescence. Yeah.
yeah, plant obsolescence. It's all Tim Apple's fault.
Yeah,
That's why we're
exactly.
here.
Yeah, this is the Apple community, right? So,
Yes. So that, folks, is us dealing out the deck. As we said before, I'll just repeat for your edification here. Our numbers across the 14 substructures, we had a 5 for government presence, a 3 for rule of law, a 4 for social services, a 2 for economic strength, a 4 for agriculture and trade, a 3 for wealth distribution, a 3 for race relations, a 3 for gender relations, a 4 for sexual orientation relations, a 5 for class relations, and then we had a 1 for religious influence, a 2 for military influence, a 2 for technology influence, and a 1 for arts and culture influence, with our government presence, economic strength, wealth distribution, and technology influence all being our trending categories. So next time, when we get into part 2, we're going to take this mess of cards and numbers, and we're going to hopefully, as I said at the very beginning of this conversation, turn it from the simple track that runs the Space Mountain roller coaster into something that looks like you're flying through outer space.
yeah.
Maybe that's an overkilled metaphor. I don't know.
It sounds like one from where I'm sitting, but
Yeah. So anyway, thanks, Trent, for going through this with me. I'm really looking forward to the next component of this, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what ideas other people who are listening to this might come up with that we didn't consider.
yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things I was going to say is that you and I have done this a lot, and I think that also tends to track your reading. Like I know for me, I mean, I've done this hundreds of times, right? And it's just the two of us. And normally in a class, I'm doing this with 4 to 5 students who are coming from different backgrounds, and they may interpret things in different ways or have different examples. Like when we were just fishing for examples, like that's one of the things that I love is someone's like, oh, well, there's this anime that does this thing. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, I'd never heard of that before. And you can always jump on a quick YouTube, whatever, or look it up on Wikipedia to get a sense of what that story is about. But that's where we'd mentioned this, I think, in the previous episode, is that ability to tap into other people's experiences, other people's media that they've consumed, and doing this with more people. Like I always tend to think that 4 is sort of like the best. 4, maybe 5 is sort of the best number to be doing this, because then you get lots of different perspectives.
And then playing the groups off of each other too. Even if they have completely different deals for the speculative worlds that they're building, I would have them share out at the end of this part of the process to have them say, here's kind of what we're thinking in this. And then as a large group discussion, you have an opportunity for the other learners to say, oh, have you considered this? Or did you think about this or whatever? And you'll get the flavor of the 4 people that are in a given group.
Yeah.
But it'll get a little bit of salt and pepper from all the other people in the room who might have some ideas to throw, or examples to give them and say, hey, go look at this or go watch this, whatever.
Yeah. And
so it ends up being super collaborative.
And just I mean, I've done lots of different iterations of this too. And I've done this where there are 4 different groups or 5 different groups in the room, and they all get the exact same numbers, and they all come up with completely different ideas of how, I mean, like more or less those main currents of the world are the same, but one might be a zombie apocalypse and one might be a moon base, right? And again, it's one of those things that as soon as you start adding the language to it, you can start interpreting, right? The values are what they are and the categories are what they are. As soon as you start bringing language and interpretation to that, then it starts to mutate and change. And going back to the book and why this is why we think it's so successful is because this is a case of active learning, right? Like you cannot be, one of the things that you need to be on the lookout for if you're doing this in a class is the student who's not participating, because if they're not participating, then they're not getting, they're not able to invest in the world in the same way. And this is where quite often there's a really boisterous, talkative student who's coming up with all the ideas, and I'm always kind of keeping an ear out to be like, can you pipe down a little bit? And assigning, this is something that if I do write a second edition for the world building book, is that a student from game design said we should all be assigned roles. Yeah. So then one person is the timekeeper, one person is making sure that everybody has gotten to say yes or no to these things, and that it makes a big difference, because sometimes you get somebody who's super excited and they just kind of steamroll everybody, and you have to prevent that, because if somebody does that, then it's 3 people working in a 4th person's world rather than 4 people collaboratively building a world. So it's something to keep in mind.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's the diversity of opinion that makes the worlds interesting. And this is exactly why you wouldn't want an LLM or a generative AI to do this for you, right? Yeah. The AI isn't going to know the experiences I've had. It's not going to know the media I've consumed. You could theoretically, I guess, dump all of these numbers and the trending pattern into Claude or ChatGPT or something, but whatever it's going to give you, even if you properly train it on what the scale means and how it can be interpreted in different ways, is never going to feel owned by the group, right? Ownership is actually a really, really important component of this. And we've talked a lot over the last 20 episodes about why we want to give students an opportunity to do inquiry-based learning or anchored instruction, or however you want to frame this specific approach in a classroom. This is why it works. Like, it doesn't work if you take away the ownership from them. And if they're lazy or they're uninterested or for whatever reason they want to dump it into an AI just to see what it says, I think they'll be really dissatisfied, because going back to our conversation about median and average and what happens when you get a world of threes, that's what AI does. It gives you the three. It's the three
brings everything
version
to the middle.
This,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
So yeah, I think that's one of the things I always loved about doing this with my own students, is just rotating around the room, sitting down, listening to what they talk about. I seldom contributed anything. I just wanted to hear from them. And so I would answer questions, or if they wanted a little bit of clarification, often they would ask, oh, is it okay if we do this? And to make the same point we have many times, it's your thing. Do whatever you want.
Yeah.
Right. I want you to own it. I want you to care about this. I want you to invest your time and energy in it. So yeah, like I said, really looking forward to part 2 of this. And we hope that all of you will join us for it. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks so much, Steve. It's fun.
See ya.
Bye.
The Worldbuilding Workshop podcast is a production of Trent Hergenrader and Steven Slota. Our theme song, Stompin' at Midnight, is a copyright-free Creative Commons production created by composer Kevin MacLeod. The show is mixed and edited by Steven Slota. The companion text, The Worldbuilding Workshop, Teaching Critical Thinking and Empathy Through World Modeling, Simulation, and Play, is published by the MIT Press, copyright 2025. Print copies can be purchased through the MIT Press website. The audiobook version, narrated by Steven Slota, is available at www.theworldbuildingworkshop.com.